The reservation book at Valenti's looked less like a seating chart and more like a catalog of the most dangerous faces along the American East Coast, and every Thursday evening, the name Ryan Calderon sat at the very top, printed in quiet gold ink that read like a warning, "Handle with care." No one on staff dared slip into carelessness when he arrived. It was not because Ryan raised his voice or flaunted his power, but rather because his silence alone could still the air in the room. Valenti's was not the type of restaurant built for noise or spectacle. Tucked away on a quiet Manhattan street, its facade blended in with other upscale Italian establishments, with dark wooden doors and a polished brass sign that reflected the mood of anyone passing by. Yet behind that elegant veneer, inside the place where wine was poured from bottles worth as much as a month's rent, Valenti's served as the silent battleground where negotiations unfolded each night, negotiations capable of reshaping the city's balance of power. There were no menus, no calls for orders. Everything was predetermined. The only uncertainty was who would still be seated at the table when dinner was over. Emily Shaw had never imagined she would one day work in a place like this. When she graduated with a degree in linguistics from a modest public university on the East Coast, she carried with her the simple hope of a stable job, a small apartment, and quiet afternoons spent reading. But life in New York was never as soft as her dreams. Her father had died when she was 13 years old in a so-called unexplained accident in Brooklyn, and from that moment on, her mother had never again managed a full, unbroken smile. Emily grew up inside silence, learning to observe, to listen, and most of all, to avoid drawing attention. She spoke flawless American English, the unmistakable Eastern cadence threading through her vowels, but deep inside her lived the Russian she had first heard from her father, a language tied to both tenderness and terror. She never spoke of it, and she had not used it for years, not until that night. Her job at Valenti's had come by chance, through a former classmate who mentioned the restaurant needed a woman who could work quietly, neatly, and without unnecessary questions. Emily fit the description perfectly. She arrived on time, performed her tasks with precision, never took part in kitchen gossip, and slipped out of sight the moment guests no longer needed her. Dressed in a fitted black uniform, soft-soled shoes, and a tight bun, she was the embodiment of professional invisibility. Even after 6 months of working there, not a single regular guest remembered her name, and that was exactly the way she wanted it. That evening, when she stepped into her shift at 6:30, a light rain tapped against the windows. The warm yellow lamps cast blurred reflections across the glossy black stone floor. Everything unfolded as it always did. Napkins folded crisp and sharp, crystal glasses polished to a cold gleam, silverware aligned with the precision of marching soldiers. Emily picked up the service ledger from the kitchen and scanned the reservations. No surprise, Ryan Calderon once again occupied the final listing, tucked at the deepest, most secluded corner of the restaurant. Table 14, 6 guests. No special requests except do not disturb and no delays. Calderon was the kind of man who made everyone in the building, including the head chef who had once cooked for a president, hold their breath. He did not threaten, did not posture, yet his gaze alone delivered warnings sharper than raised voices. He wore simple but expensive clothes, hand-tailored black suits, and Italian shoes polished to a mirror. Emily had served him a few times before, following the rules religiously. Never look for more than 3 seconds, never stand closer than half a meter, and never listen in. But this time, as she approached table 14 carrying a bottle of Bordeaux from 1992, she sensed something had shifted. Calderon was not accompanied only by his familiar guards. 2 unfamiliar men sat across from him, their faces rigid, their clothes mismatched, gray suits slightly too loose, ties poorly chosen. They were not drinking, not eating, just talking, and they were speaking Russian. Not the softened Russian tinged with Ukrainian or Baltic inflections, but pure Moscow Russian, edged with the cold tones she had once heard from former military officers in old recordings. Emily stood less than 2 meters away, her hand steady on the wine tray, her heartbeat slowing in that instinctive way one feels before stepping into danger. She did not want to listen, yet the words still reached her like a gust of winter wind, long buried in her memory. The shipment will arrive on Tuesday, but the price has changed. Your Italian friend must understand we are done negotiating. She froze for a long second that felt like an eternity. Her hands did not tremble, but her mind spiraled back to her father, the man who had once translated phrases like these and the cold shadow of what they meant. She should have turned away, pretended she understood nothing, as she always did. But tonight the wind shifted, and so did Emily. If you are still listening, you can probably feel the tension in that room, the way every word carried the weight of a life, and how a single glance could thicken the air. Before we continue with what happens to Emily and Ryan Calderon, make sure you subscribe to our channel, like, and share, so you never miss the gripping, mysterious stories we bring to you every day. We would love to know where you are listening from. Leave the name of your city or country in the comments below. Every comment is a mark on the map that tells us how far this story has traveled and how many hearts it has touched. Ryan Calderon arrived 10 minutes later than usual, enough for the staff polishing wine glasses to exchange brief glances and for the hostess to twist her wristwatch 3 times without actually looking at it. But when the heavy wooden door swung open and he stepped in from the faint drizzle outside, no one dared betray a flicker of distraction. He moved without glancing around, his black shoes untouched by rain, his coat draped across his shoulders as if even the wind respected his presence. Ryan Calderon always brought with him a different kind of atmosphere, not arrogance, but the type of silence that made others straighten their posture, lower their voices, and step back without knowing why. From behind the bar, Emily saw him nod slightly to a male server before heading straight to table 14. 3 men were already seated there, all familiar faces within the organization. Luke Garcia, the financial handler, Marcus Dozier, a former Marine, and Juno Tran, a Vietnamese-American specializing in transportation. They sat upright, untouched glasses before them. When Ryan took his seat, 2 more men joined the table. They were not introduced. No one needed to ask. 2 Eastern European men, faces stiff as forged steel. One was broad-shouldered with a scar running from his left brow to his cheekbone. The other was thin, tapping his fingers against the table in a rhythm that felt like counting invisible debts. Emily poured the wine quietly, masking every reaction, yet she heard them clearly. Their voices rolled out in precise, chilling Russian. She had heard her father use that tone when she was young, when he answered late-night calls with clenched jaw, while her mother stood behind the door clutching her chest. "They must understand," the scarred man said in Russian, drawing out each word as if pressing them into the table. "We are out of time. If the agreement does not change, then perhaps your Italian friend should prepare to explain to his rival why he lost the only opportunity in 10 years. The air around the table thickened. Calderon did not respond. He simply turned to Luke, his voice sharp as the edge of a knife. "Which one of you understands Russian?" Luke shook his head. Juno did the same. Marcus muttered, "I can count to 10, but if they are talking weapons, I am out." Ryan tapped his finger once, the sound cracking the tension. "We have people who speak Spanish, French, Mandarin, even Hebrew. Yet not one person understands Russian." His tone never rose, but something inside it vibrated with restrained fury that silenced the entire table. "I pay all of you to be ready for every situation, and right now I am nothing but a deaf man in my own meeting." The thin man slid out his phone, tapped the screen, and handed it to Calderon. A list of names appeared, written in Cyrillic script. In Russian, without glancing at anyone but Ryan, he said, "If you do not agree, we will sell to someone else. The Colombians are very interested in this shipment, and they will not need a translator." Emily stood almost perfectly still, her hand resting beside the wineglass. Her heartbeat slowed, then surged. The words cut into her memory like blades. Transport, shipment, price change, names. One thought pulsed in her mind. This is the language her father died for. Calderon turned to the head server near the bar. "Water for table 14. The man nodded, then leaned toward Emily, whispering through clenched teeth, "You go. Do not look them in the eye. And be quick." Emily nodded. Her steps were soundless on the polished floor. She carried the crystal water carafe with her gaze lowered to the tablecloth, never lifting her eyes. But her ears caught everything. "If Moretti refuses," the scarred man said, "then we will talk. And if we talk, what happened in Philadelphia, in Atlantic City, and with Judge Henderson, everything will come out." Emily nearly dropped the carafe. Henderson. She had seen that name flash across television months earlier. A sudden resignation, rumors of bribery, whispers about Mafia ties. Others mentioned Russia. Now the pieces fell into place. These men were sitting on information powerful enough to collapse an entire web of influence. And no one at the table understood what they were saying, except her. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured water into the scarred man's glass. He glanced at her for a second, his eyes slicing across the bridge of her nose like a blade. Then he turned away and continued speaking. Emily clenched her teeth. She should have walked away. She should not have listened. But something old and restless had risen inside her, something she had tried to bury for years. She did not just understand their words. She understood the meaning beneath them, the threats, the lives dangling between each syllable. And for the first time in many years, Emily no longer wanted to remain silent. "He should not have mentioned Judge Henderson again," the thin man continued, his voice as cold as metal meeting ice, "because we have stayed silent far too long. And now it is your turn to decide whether you want to keep your dignity or keep your life." Ryan Calderon stared directly at the man's mouth, not blinking once, and no one at the table added a single word, because no one understood, not one syllable, except Emily. She did not know what inside her had shifted, only that some thin wire stretched tight for so many years suddenly snapped loose. Perhaps it was the scarred man's glance earlier, the way it lingered as if he knew she understood. Perhaps it was the mention of Henderson, a name her father had uttered in the fragmented remnants of memory before he was killed. Or perhaps it was simply the terrifying silence of 6 powerful men facing one another while entirely oblivious to what was being spoken across the table. Emily set the water carafe down with the softness of a feather. No one noticed. She stepped back half a pace, then spoke in English, her voice low, clear, and cold as the edge of a razor. "They said if you do not accept the new price, they will sell to the Colombians. They also said that if this explodes, you will be the first one offered up as a sacrifice." The entire table froze. Marcus lifted his head as if bewildered someone was speaking. Luke frowned. Juno blinked once. Ryan did not move, but his eyes sliced through the air. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, tightly held. Emily did not look away. "I understand Russian," she said, her gaze steady on him, "and they are blackmailing you." The scarred man leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. The thin man stopped moving, his fingers resting flat on the table as if waiting for a signal to pull a trigger. "Say more," Ryan ordered. It was not a request. It was a command. Emily nodded. "They said the Colombians do not need a translator. They believe you are playing at power without holding any cards. And if you refuse the deal, they will release everything, including what happened in Philadelphia, Atlantic City, and Judge Henderson." Ryan studied her for a long moment, as if testing whether she was an illusion, then turned to the 2 Russian men, his voice calm as a still lake. "I have someone who understands you." The scarred man curled a crooked smile, part mockery, part curiosity. "Good. Then she can tell you that your time is up." Emily looked at him, and for the first time in nearly 15 years, she spoke Russian in front of anyone outside her past. "Он говорит, что ваше время вышло," she said, her voice sharp and precise, each word as clean as a blade. The man nodded, signaling the thin one to rise. "We will send the revised contract in the morning," Emily translated again. The scarred man adjusted his collar, glancing at Calderon. "And if you refuse, let the Americans handle the legal consequences." They left without a farewell, the restaurant door opening and closing within 10 quiet seconds. No one spoke, no one moved. Ryan Calderon continued to look at Emily without blinking. "Since when?" he asked. "Since childhood," she answered, her voice steady. "My father was Russian. I hid that because I do not trust this place, and I do not want to speak of the past." Ryan nodded slowly, then turned to Luke. "No one touches her. No one asks her anything. No one says a word until I say so." He stood. "Emily, come with me." She nodded. No one stopped her. No one dared. When the door to the private hallway closed behind them, Valenti's fell into a strange kind of silence. In the kitchen, knives still sliced, and water still boiled. But the people who had stood near table 14 understood one thing with absolute clarity. An unspoken rule had just been shattered, and the one who broke it was not a mafia boss, not an agent, not an assassin, but a small, quiet server with a velvet soft voice and eyes that carried a past no one else in that room had ever dared to face. The private room behind Valenti's was not large, but it was completely soundproof, with soft amber light falling from an Italian chandelier that hung low from the ceiling and cast a gentle reflection across the ebony table. Ryan Calderon pulled out a chair for Emily, a gesture so courteous it felt almost suspicious in a moment like this. Then he sat across from her, his hands laced together on the table, his back straight, his gaze unrelenting. No bodyguards, no Russian, just the 2 of them, and a truth that had just been dragged up from the deep. Emily took her seat with the posture of a woman still technically at work, her back straight, her hands resting neatly on her knees, avoiding neither his eyes nor the weight of the moment. Silence held them for about 10 seconds before Ryan finally spoke, his voice calm but colder by several degrees. "I do not like surprises in my own space, Emily. How much do you know about them?" Emily did not need clarification. "Only what I heard," she said. "I am not on anyone's side. I only understand them." Ryan nodded slightly, letting the pause stretch before tilting his head. "Your father was Russian?" Emily drew in a slow breath, as if she had to reach deep to pull the memory up. "His name was Alexei Ivanovich Sharov. He came to America in the late 1980s. He worked for a language research center, at least that is what the paperwork said. My mother told me he had been a strategic interpreter for the former Soviet Union, and after he defected, he became a collaborator for a few federal agencies here." Ryan's brows rose, the surprise unhidden. "So he betrayed both sides." Emily pressed her lips together. "He did not betray anyone. He only wanted a peaceful life, but neither side would leave him alone." Her voice no longer carried the hard edge she had used translating Russian at the table. A different layer seeped in weariness, and a sorrow so familiar it no longer needed a name. "He was killed when I was 13. They said it was an accident. His car lost control and hit a light pole. But that night, my mother heard an engine rev twice outside our building, and they found a briefcase burned in the trunk, a briefcase that did not belong to him. He had been holding it for someone else." Ryan did not interrupt. He simply watched her, waiting for her to continue. She lowered her head slightly, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her skirt. "I grew up with two things: silence and suspicion. My mother never believed he died in an accident, but she could not prove anything. She only told me one thing: never let anyone know you understand Russian. Do not let the daughter of Alexei Sharov become the last loose thread of a story no one wants to reopen." Ryan leaned back, exhaling softly. "And you hid that for how long?" 15 years, Emily said. "I did not use Russian. I did not read it, did not write it, did not speak it. I did everything to make it disappear from my mind. But it never disappeared. It only waited." Ryan nodded slowly. "And tonight, it chose to return." Emily met his eyes. "I did not choose the timing. They did. If I had stayed silent, you would have signed your own death sentence." Ryan let out a small, unusual smile. Not mocking, not approving, just something strange and unreadable. "You think I needed to be saved?" Emily did not answer. She tilted her head slightly. "I think you should understand the language of the men preparing to stab you in the back." Ryan rose and walked a slow circle around the room, as if trying to dispel the tension. "If what you are saying is true, those men did not come only for the shipment. They came to send a message." Emily nodded. "They know you do not have a translator. They see that as a weakness. They are using language as a weapon." Ryan turned to her again, the suspicion in his eyes fading but not entirely gone. "I need to know which side you are on." Emily stood. "I am not on a side. I am on the side of the truth, and I want to know why my father died. If you want to know who is tightening a net around you, then maybe we can help each other." Ryan fell silent again, then walked to the door, opened it, and looked back. "Go home tonight. Come back tomorrow at 10 in the morning. Do not be late, and do not bring your past with you unless you are prepared to dig into it." Emily stepped past him without a word, but as the door closed behind her, Ryan Calderon understood one thing with perfect clarity. That Small, the quiet server, had just brought into the game something he had never possessed before: a silent ace who knew exactly when to hold her tongue and exactly when to break the silence wide open. The next morning, at exactly 10 o'clock, Emily arrived at the back entrance of Valenti's, and the steel door that was usually kept shut swung open the moment she knocked twice, revealing Marcus with his familiar guarded stare. Though this time there was no greeting, no polite nod, only a silent gesture for her to follow. He led her down a narrow hallway lined with surveillance cameras, past the kitchen where preparations for the lunch service were already underway, then stopped before another steel door tucked behind a rack of wine bottles. Inside was a small conference room with no windows, no sound, only a glass table, 2 chairs facing each other, and a laptop already open. Ryan was seated there, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled high, no longer looking like the imposing restaurant owner but more like a man preparing to step into a battlefield. On the table lay a medium-sized black leather notebook, its corners worn, its leather tie knotted as if it had been kept for reasons far deeper than its monetary value. Emily stepped inside, offered a nod in place of a greeting, her gaze settling on the notebook. Ryan pushed it toward her without a word. She sat, loosened the leather knot, and opened the first page. She stilled. Lines of poetry written in Old Russian script stretched before her, the dark blue ink straight and precise like mechanical printing, yet the line breaks made no sense. Some verses indented or shifted as though intentionally misaligned. She turned a few more pages. There were at least 30 poems, each composed of 4 to 6 stanzas, all in a classical style. No author. New dates. New notes. Ryan spoke at last, his voice low and steady. That notebook was handed to me 2 weeks ago by one of my Eastern European contacts. At first I thought it was some pretentious literary game, but then the man who brought it to me was killed in a car crash 72 hours later. No identification on him, and in his phone, only 2 photos, page 3 and page 7. Emily turned to page 3, a poem about a ship leaving a harbor at midnight, carrying cold northern winds and memories hidden beneath its floorboards. Page 7 told of a nameless man standing in a square without monuments, yet everyone watched him as if they had waited for him their entire lives. She looked up. These use historical symbols, metaphors, a blend of archaic Russian and dialectal Siberian phonetics. Ryan nodded. I do not need poetry. I need information. And I am certain there is a code in there. An old acquaintance from intelligence once told me, when Russians use poetry, it means they are talking for real. Emily nodded. They used poetic ciphers during the Second World War, embedding messages in rhythm, changing key words daily. Each poem becomes a unit of transmission. The problem is, she flipped to page 10, then 12, studying the odd punctuation, the staggered lines. Ciphers like this require a key one word or phrase that anchors the entire pattern. Ryan opened the laptop, typed several commands, then turned the screen toward her. It showed a photo of a wrinkled sheet of silver paper with a handwritten line in Russian. The thing only a traitor would remember. Emily read the line 3 times, then nodded slowly. That is the hint, possibly the key. Ryan folded his arms, eyes never leaving her face. I need you to decode it. All of it. Every poem. Every line. And if anything in there points to transactions, names, schedules, or locations, I want to know before anyone else figures it out. Emily closed the notebook, her expression heavier. I will do it. But I need time, private space, and someone I trust to watch my back if anything happens. Ryan tilted his head. Then you have one day. In this room, Marcus will stand outside. No one goes in. No one brings a phone. And Emily, he paused, if you find something more dangerous than what I expect, do not stay silent. This time, speak. Emily looked at him and nodded without hesitation. She was no longer the quiet server hiding behind a tray and lowered eyes. She was about to step into a world built from whispered deaths, where each stanza could conceal an arms deal or a death sentence written in the most beautiful language mankind had ever created. Emily spent the entire morning inside the small, windowless room, the pale golden light settling over the pages like a thin veil of fog over her thoughts. In front of her lay the black leather notebook, and beside it Ryan's laptop with no internet connection, used only for temporary notes. Outside the door, Marcus stood as still as a statue, neither speaking nor shifting, tapping the floor lightly every 15 minutes as a quiet signal that she was still safe. Each poem was a maze. Some carried the cadence of old verse, structured like Pushkin, yet threaded with modern vocabulary. Others were nearly unreadable, as if deliberately distorted to obscure their true rhythm. Emily marked every period, every blank space, comparing the patterns against ancient cipher charts. She discovered that the opening stanzas often contained locations, while the closing stanzas implied actions. But the middle, always the middle, held the critical data, embedded within repeating structures. The 8th poem made her pause longer than usual. It described a kestrel perched on a wire, watching a group of people slip into a forest in silence. The 4th line contained a phrase out of rhythm. The darkness did not fall, it crawled. In cipher language, that was a signal for surveillance. She turned the page. The next poem spoke of a gatekeeper named M, holding a notebook that listed 50 people allowed into a dark room without a lock. She circled the letter M, not a common symbol, likely an initial. She flipped back to the 5th poem where it mentioned the keeper of keys who once served beneath the yellow flag. In espionage terminology, the yellow flag had been a code name for a group of mercenaries operating in Africa under the cover of a private security firm. One of Ryan's trusted men had served in that firm, Marcus. Emily frowned, not out of immediate suspicion, but because the first blurry outline of a pattern was beginning to emerge. The 13th poem repeated twice the phrases "the sleepless eye" and "the darkness dressed as an ally." She stopped. These were no longer generic metaphors, they were warnings. One poem described a meeting of 6 men, but only 5 spoke. The 6th wrote notes, then left without a word. In the poem, that man took a teacup from a servant, whose arm bore a tattoo of 3 stripes. Juno was the only one in Ryan's circle who had a 3-stripe tattoo on his wrist, a mark he usually hid beneath his watch. Emily remembered how Juno was always the last to leave a meeting, always smiling yet rarely contributing his voice. And in a stanza written in a list-like pattern, 3 figures appeared: the one who crossed the frozen river on foot, the one who picked locks inside an abandoned church, and the one who sang lullabies in a voice not his own. Emily knew enough about Russian allegorical poetry to recognize that these were not accidental images. The one who sang lullabies in a voice not his own was likely someone pretending to be what he was not, someone who spoke a language that did not belong to him. She reviewed her notes. In the meeting the night before, only one man had a surname that matched no public records, no digital footprint, no financial past: Luke Garcia, who had materialized in the organization 2 years earlier as the newly appointed financial handler after his predecessor had been murdered. Emily looked at the 21st poem again, where it mentioned the man who counted money printed on false paper and vanished whenever the window opened. She wrote beside it, "Luke, Juno, Marcus." She did not conclude anything yet, but a heaviness seeped into her chest. This was not poetry. This was a map of betrayal, and at least 3 names in Ryan's inner circle might be tied to something far larger than a shipment. It could be leaks. It could be feeding information to an enemy. Or worse, 2 of them might be working for opposing forces at the same time. Emily sat motionless for several minutes, her eyes fixed on the pages as if waiting for them to speak. She did not dare report anything yet, not without proof. But for the first time, she understood she was not simply decoding a ciphered notebook. She was touching the exposed heart of a system rotting from the inside. And every line of poetry was screaming in its own silence that the most dangerous shadow was not approaching from the outside. It was already sitting at the table, drinking wine, and calling her by name. Emily stepped out of the coding room near 7 o'clock that evening. Her eyes weighted as if she carried an entire collapsing world inside her mind. Ryan waited in the hallway, saying nothing, simply giving her a faint nod before gesturing for her to follow. They remained silent until they reached his private office, where the light softened and the distant noise of the restaurant faded into a muted background hum. Emily placed the notebook on the desk, her hands still aching from nearly 8 uninterrupted hours of writing. She did not go into details. She simply said she had found passages that pointed to a physical location and to a major recent event. Ryan frowned and signaled her to continue. Emily opened the notebook and pointed to a poem on the final page, the longest and most tangled of them all. It described an unnamed warehouse located where the road is lined with 2 rows of broken power poles, and where trucks cannot turn around. And it mentioned the night of the 17th, when the fire did not come from nature, and when the smell of ammonia made the sky twist. Emily translated it plainly, without hesitation. That is the only poem that clearly describes an actual location and a real event. The warehouse fire in western New Jersey 3 weeks ago. Officials called it a chemical accident, but the firefighters' report said they found traces of industrial-grade explosives. Ryan rose to his feet and paced slowly, his face tightening. "Are you certain?" Emily flipped through the pages and pointed to other related lines. Another poem speaks of a man who traded 7 steel barrels to buy the silence of the city. Steel here is not meant literally. It could be a metaphor for contraband or weapons. And if I am reading this correctly, one of your shipments, or a partner's shipment, was deliberately destroyed. Not an accident. Sabotage. Ryan stared at her, both hands pressed to the desk, his gaze darkening. If that is true, someone inside is feeding information. Emily nodded. And whoever it is knows exactly what they are doing. They did not destroy a random deal. They destroyed a transfer point, a node that connects several larger routes. If that warehouse had burned due to natural causes, the poem would not describe fire that did not come from nature. And ammonia is often used to mask controlled detonations. Ryan dropped heavily into his chair, lost in thought for a long moment. What else? Emily opened the laptop and retyped a coded sequence that appeared repeatedly across 3 different poems. Each time the phrase appeared, it was paired with the keywords 6 steps, 3-layer mask, and steel melting beneath the clock. She explained, I believe this is an operational cipher. 6 steps may mean a procedure. A 3-layer mask suggests multiple layers of anonymity. Steel melting beneath the clock could indicate a time limit, or someone working from within the technical division. Ryan cut in. Juno. Emily gave a small nod. I cannot confirm yet, but all indicators point to the warehouse being burned because someone inside passed information out, and we are reading the story from the perspective of the person who carried out the act. Ryan exhaled heavily, revealing fatigue for the first time. Do you think the person who wrote these poems is still alive? Emily considered. Not certain. But if he is, then he is trying to warn someone. Not you. Someone who would only understand after everything else fails. Someone like me. Or someone else who can read what these poems are hiding. Ryan stood slowly. I will have the security footage around the warehouse pulled again. I will review the schedules of Juno, Luke, and Marcus for the last 3 weeks. And you, Emily, keep reading. Every word, every blank space, every misplaced accent, everything might be in there, waiting for someone who understands the language to drag it back into the light. Emily looked at him, her eyes now free of fear or doubt. She nodded, speaking softly, like a vow that required no ceremony. I will not stop. Not when my father may have died because of the same system, and not when others may be dying in the dark simply because they do not understand the poems screaming in silence. 2 days after Emily uncovered the poems connected to the warehouse fire, Ryan called an emergency meeting in the basement of Valenti's. Not in the small conference room reserved for discreet dinners, but in the fortified chamber behind a steel door weighing more than 100 kilograms, where there was no cell signal, no cameras, and only 4 chairs arranged in a square. Present in the room were Ryan, Marcus, Luke, Juno, and Emily. None of them knew why they had been summoned, but the air was so heavy it needed no explanation. A storm was gathering. Ryan entered last, placing a thick stack of documents on the table, a silver USB drive on top, and 3 printed photographs beside it. He did not speak at first, only gestured toward Marcus. Read. Marcus picked up one of the photographs, and his expression froze. It was a security camera image taken shortly before the warehouse went up in flames. A man stood near a truck, wearing gloves and a baseball cap, and though the image was blurry, the distinctive brown jacket and the slightly hunched posture were unmistakable. It was Juno. Juno did not react immediately. He merely raised an eyebrow, tilting his head as if assessing how convincing the image truly was. Ryan signaled again. Marcus opened the folder and read aloud. Juno's vehicle tracking log on the night of the fire. According to it, his car left the lot at 10:37 that night and returned around 2 in the morning, with no listed reason for the trip. The GPS route did not match the schedule Juno had previously reported. Instead of visiting the girlfriend he claimed to be seeing, the car had stopped near the industrial zone in western New Jersey, less than 2 blocks from the fire site. Ryan did not need to say more. His gaze was a verdict already delivered. Juno leaned back, crossed his arms, and let out a faint laugh. You really think I torched our own warehouse because of a blurry camera shot and a mismatched GPS log? Ryan, I have worked for you for nearly 6 years. I am the one who got you out of the Bronx raid without spilling a single drop of blood, and now you look at a fuzzy picture and call me a traitor? Ryan did not answer, but his eyes shifted to Emily. She pulled from her pocket a neatly folded sheet, a copy of a poem no one else but she and Ryan had seen. In it, one line repeated 3 times, describing the courier who never speaks, who bows his head only when blood drips from the left sleeve. She looked at Juno and said softly, You have a scar on your left arm. I saw it when you pulled your sleeve up to check your watch. And you always bow your head whenever someone mentions the name Dasha. She is the contact from the other side, isn't she? Juno stopped smiling. No one spoke. The air thickened. Ryan stepped closer, stopping only a few feet away. I do not need your confession, because our contact at the FBI already confirmed that Dasha is the intermediary in the failed Warsaw Exchange, and according to files retrieved from the Polish authorities, she had at least 3 meetings with a man carrying an American passport under a forged Argentine identity. That passport was issued in the same location where you were detained during the electronic smuggling case in 2015. Juno exhaled slowly. I did not have a choice. If I refused, they would kill my mother. She lives alone in Texas, has medical records and no insurance. They know everything. Ryan did not nod, did not gesture. He simply said one word, Marcus. Marcus stepped forward and placed a hand on Juno's shoulder. Not violently, not even firmly, just a quiet farewell. Emily lowered her eyes to the table, saying nothing. She knew what would follow. Not now, not here. But Juno would never walk into Valenti's again. Ryan looked around the room, his voice hoarse but steady. One traitor is exposed, but if there is one, there will be two. Remember this, the poem never lies. And from now on, we will read every line as if our lives depend on it, because very likely, they do. After Juno was taken away, no one in the organization mentioned him again. No one asked where he was, whether he was safe, or what would happen next. The silence settled like a sheet of ice sealing over a fracture, carrying the grim implication that from now on, anyone unmasked would be erased as if they had never existed. Emily returned to the coding room with the notebook in hand and her mind in disarray, but the deeper she dug, the more she felt something was wrong. The poems, though exquisitely detailed and rich with implication, had a smoothness to them that was almost rehearsed. Their metaphors intricate yet unnervingly consistent, as if deliberately crafted to guide the reader toward a predetermined conclusion. Emily began to ask herself, why her? Why had the notebook landed in Ryan's hands at precisely the right moment? And why was she the only one capable of deciphering all the layers hidden inside, when men with real intelligence backgrounds, men like Juno, apparently could not? In the 28th poem, a line spoke of the woman who believes she is reading, but is in truth being written. The words sent a chill through her. She repeated them silently, again and again, like an echo rising from the bottom of a well. She checked the sequence of the poems and noticed something strange. Whenever a poem revealed dangerous information, the following one was gentle, soothing, almost comforting, as if designed to regulate the reader's emotional rhythm. It did not resemble a genuine intelligent cipher. It looked like something constructed, a script, a stage play written to lead someone down a specific path. And that someone was her. Emily examined the handwriting, the ink strokes, and found a detail far too small to ignore. 3 of the poems were written with a slight left-leaning slant, while the rest stood upright. She had studied handwriting analysis in college out of personal curiosity and knew that a leftward tilt often belonged to someone left-handed. She sifted through memory. Her father had been left-handed, and Ryan was left-handed as well. But Ryan never wrote in front of her. A cold tightness gripped her chest. She revisited the poem about the warehouse fire. Every detail matched internal information, yet none of it confirmed the identity of the perpetrator. It looked less like evidence and more like bait that led her to suspect Juno, which in turn led Ryan to act, and then Juno was eliminated. Too perfect, too timely. She turned back to the earlier poems, the ones that spoke of the awakened eye that will never see itself in the mirror, and another line declaring that the ones who write the poems no longer exist, yet still control the play like puppeteers behind the curtain. Emily froze. Could it be that the writer had anticipated someone like her would decipher it? Could it be they were not warning but manipulating her? She sat motionless in the sealed room, the yellow light casting a muted glow across the pages, her palms damp with sweat. She no longer knew whether she was leading the game or simply following the precise steps some unseen hand had already laid out for her. She thought of Ryan, of the coincidence of him giving her the notebook, of the way he watched her, with suspicion and something that felt like testing. What if he was part of the design? What if this was all a trap, a loyalty check, or worse, a piece of a far larger scheme meant to quietly remove threats without leaving a legal trail? Emily pressed her fingers to her temples and closed her eyes. For the first time since the decoding began, she felt utterly lost. There was no longer a clear line between right and wrong, truth and fiction, warning and manipulation. She was being led. And if that was true, then who was the one holding the strings of the puppet named Emily Shaw? The first rain of the season poured down over New York at midday, cold and heavy, as if the city were trying to wash away something it no longer wished to keep. Emily stood by the third-floor window of Valenti's, watching the water trail down the glass like invisible paths carved from memory. In her hands was the poetry manuscript, now covered with nearly 100 pages of notes, yet her mind could no longer cling to the words. Ever since realizing she might be the one being manipulated, every line of logic had turned chaotic. She no longer knew whom to trust, and she was no longer certain she could trust herself. In the basement below, Ryan was holding a closed-door meeting with Luke and Marcus, reviewing every supply chain and transaction from the previous 4 months since Juno had been taken away. There were no suspicious reports, and that was precisely what kept Ryan awake at night. The absence of mistakes meant someone was cleaning up far too well. He had never trusted cleanliness in the smuggling world. It only appeared when someone knew they were being watched. Or worse, when everything had already been arranged to explode. Emily stepped away from the window, heading toward the back corridor when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the service passage. The pace was uneven, rushed, unlike any staff member she had ever heard. She turned, meaning to call for Marcus, when suddenly the glass door behind the kitchen shattered. The first explosion came from the loading area, where deliveries were usually received. Metal screamed, followed by a shout. A kitchen worker ran past the hallway, his face drained of color, blood spreading along his sleeve. Emily backed up, hitting the wine shelf, her hands trembling as she grabbed her phone, only to find there was no signal. She sprinted toward the stairwell leading to the basement and keyed in the code. The recognition system lagged, as though jammed. A second blast erupted, this time closer. She pushed through the door, slipping as water and smoke began seeping from the ventilation system. The basement reeked of burning plastic and gasoline. By the time she reached the meeting room, Ryan was already standing at the center with a black Glock in hand. Marcus was checking the emergency exits while Luke worked frantically at the central control panel. No one spoke, but the look in their eyes made it clear. This was no break-in. This was an organized strike. Ryan saw Emily, and something flashed in his gaze, an icy, tempered fury she had never seen in him before. He signaled sharply. "With me, escape tunnel number 3. Emily followed close behind him, Marcus guarding the rear. They moved through 3 layers of security doors and descended into the old wine cellar that had been converted into an emergency passage. The corridor was narrow, the concrete walls cold, the emergency lights blinking in dull red pulses. Gunfire erupted above them, not scattered but in clean, measured bursts, like trained soldiers. Luke disappeared into the technical floor. No one had seen him since the control panel locked. Ryan stopped midway down the tunnel and pulled a metal key from his jacket, opening a recessed wall safe. Inside was a small case in a black leather pouch. He tossed the case to Marcus and turned to Emily. "I do not know who is behind this, but it is not some small-time outfit. This is systematic cleansing. If we do not get out in 10 minutes, none of us will survive to recount it." Emily nodded just as the third explosion roared behind them. The walls shuddered, dust falling from the concrete ceiling. Marcus unlocked the final door, leading them into the old bootlegging exit used during Prohibition, a 600-meter tunnel that emptied into the alley behind Valenti's abandoned storage building. When they reached the outer door, Ryan paused, pressing an ear to the wall. No footsteps, no pursuit. But he did not relax. The 3 of them stepped out into the pounding rain, smoke still clinging to their clothes. Emily glanced back at the faint orange glow flickering from the 3rd floor, shining against the gray sky. She knew Valenti's was gone. Everything inside had been burned to wipe the slate clean. But what chilled her more was the thought that surfaced in her mind. If someone wanted to throw her into the center of this war, this moment was merely the opening act. And if that was true, then whoever was writing this script had not only calculated every line of poetry, they had calculated the escape route. And who would live long enough to keep playing their part in a story that was nowhere near its final scene? The tunnel behind the old warehouse was so dark that Emily had to place her hand against the wall to keep her balance, each icy brick cold as the skin of the dead. They did not stop to rest, not even for a breath, their ragged breathing echoing through the damp passage like ghosts chasing their own reflections. Ryan led the way, gun in hand, his eyes fixed forward without glancing back even once. Marcus stayed close behind Emily, one hand holding a small flashlight, the other hovering near his weapon. In the thick air, heavy with the smell of dust and rusted metal, every sound grew larger than life. Their footsteps struck the metal flooring like a drumbeat calling death closer. Emily felt each heartbeat rising into her throat, yet panic was a luxury she could not afford. Every step felt like crossing a field of hidden mines, where even a single wrong breath could bring everything crashing down. They moved through 3 junctions, each protected by old steel doors locked with mechanical codes. Ryan worked quickly and without hesitation, as if he had rehearsed this moment long ago, and perhaps he had. Only a man who lived under constant threat would devise an escape route that demanded such silent, disciplined readiness. When they reached the crossroads leading toward an abandoned subway station, Marcus suddenly halted and signaled for silence. All three froze, listening. A faint scrape of metal drifted from far behind them, unmistakably intentional. Someone else was coming down into the tunnel. Ryan looked at Marcus. No words were needed. Marcus nodded once, turned back, and raised his gun. He did not run. He would stay behind to hold the line. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Ryan's hand closed around hers, a firm, unyielding pressure that told her everything. Survival depended not on strength now, but on clarity, on who could remain steady the longest. Ryan pulled her forward, faster this time. They rushed through the old corridor supported by concrete pillars coated in moss, wires hanging around them like tangled webs. Ahead, a faint green glow began to pulse the emergency exit leading into the maintenance chamber of the abandoned rail station from the 1990s. Ryan pushed the door open, entered first with his weapon raised, then motioned for Emily once the room proved empty. The heavy metal door shut behind them with a sound that felt like the world they had known sealing itself off forever. They stood inside a forgotten control room, now nothing but severed cables and rusted panels. Ryan pulled aside a dusty rug, revealing a steel floor hatch. With a key, he unlocked it, revealing a ladder into a dry conduit beneath. Emily no longer questioned anything. She simply followed. 10 minutes later, they emerged from a storm drain behind an industrial strip on the outskirts of Queens. Rain still poured, wind hurling cold sheets of water against their faces. They were both soaked, but neither felt the cold. Emily gasped for breath as Ryan closed the hatch behind them, his eyes holding a flicker of something close to despair, though not yet broken. He turned to her, his voice low and solid as earth. Marcus will be all right. If he did not come back, he chose it. Emily nodded faintly. She had no tears left. They had just escaped an execution staged to look like an accident, and now, in the gray, punishing rain of New York, they were no longer merely survivors. They were the last two pieces left on a chessboard whose player had never once shown their face. They took shelter in a small apartment above an old laundromat in Astoria, a place Ryan had once used as a contact point during the years he moved shipments across Canada. The room was almost bare, holding only 2 chairs, a wooden table, and a military-style folding bed. Emily sat at the table with the poetry notebook open before her, her hands trembling from exhaustion and a restlessness she could not quite name. During their escape, she had managed to grab several loose pages she had once assumed were drafts. They had been hidden at the bottom of the safe in Ryan's room, unmarked and undecorated. Yet instinct told her they were fragments someone had deliberately separated from the main book. As the dim light from the filament bulb washed over the paper, she began to read, each line spiraling into her with a strange, uncanny familiarity that raised the hairs along her arms. One poem began with the image of a woman standing by a window, watching the first rain of the season fall over a foreign city. A woman who carries no true name but carries the voice of her past. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. She had stood by that window, in that exact place, 3 days earlier, when Ryan dealt with the matter of Juno. Another poem spoke of the child born of 2 worlds, raised on forbidden language and inherited silence, destined to become the final link binding 2 mirrored histories. She read the line twice, then a third time. There was no denying it anymore. The writer of these words knew her. Not simply someone who knew about her, but someone who knew she would one day read them. A passage written in an old poetic cadence mentioned, "The daughter of the man who refused to bow to the Institute of Control, carrying within her the key to the door FSB sealed 30 years ago." She sat frozen. FSB, the Russian intelligence agency. Her father, before he died, had been monitored by that very institution for refusing to cooperate in a military technology transfer. They believed he had betrayed them, though they never found enough evidence to charge him. And then he vanished after a so-called car accident in Brooklyn, a death no one looked too closely at. Emily lifted her gaze to Ryan, who stood leaning against the doorway, his expression shadowed. He did not need to ask. He spoke only one quiet sentence. "You have read it, haven't you?" She nodded. "These poems are not just codes, they are instructions. And she faltered, "I am part of their plan from the beginning. I do not know how, but whoever wrote them knew I would read them. They did not guess. They steered me toward them." Ryan stepped forward and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "If FSB is behind this, the target is not me, not Valenti's. It is you. You are the tool." Emily closed her eyes. Everything she had once believed were personal circumstances, the death of her father, her secrecy about her Russian heritage, her ability to understand coded language no longer felt like accidents of fate. They were conditions, selected variables. Perhaps from the start, even her working at Valenti's, meeting Ryan, stepping into this world, perhaps all of it was merely the next phase of a plan that had begun before she even understood who she was. "I do not know if I am the prey or the piece on the board," she whispered, her hand brushing the final line of a poem she had never seen until now. The line was written in faded ink, so small it almost vanished into the paper. "If you can read this, you have gone too far to turn back, and you must choose, blood or shadow." Ryan said nothing. Outside, the rain kept falling in steady rhythms, and in that quiet room, Emily understood she was no longer the one decoding poems. She was the cipher that every hidden force was trying to read before time ran out. 2 days after discovering the final poem that mentioned her by name, Emily and Ryan were still hiding in the small apartment above the laundromat, surviving on canned food and broken, sweat-soaked sleep. They did not go outside, did not touch any electronic device that might be tracked, and barely spoke unless absolutely necessary. With every passing second, Emily felt as if some unseen link were tightening around her throat, though she could not tell whether it came from the FSB or from forces her imagination was still too small to name. And then, just before dawn on the third morning, when the streetlights still flickered through the dense Astoria fog, the old wooden door exploded inward with a dry, decisive thud. Ryan yanked Emily down beside the cabinet, gun already in hand, but before he could move, a man's voice rang out firm, commanding, carrying no threat, yet allowing no refusal. "FBI, do not move." The room flooded with the white blast of high-powered flashlights as 4 agents dressed in black swept in, badges and weapons gleaming in the fractured light. Emily lifted her hands, eyes still adjusting, when a female agent approached and steadied her with a small, reassuring nod. "We are here to ensure your safety, Emily Shaw." Ryan lowered his gun slowly, doubt still etched across his face. A slender, middle-aged man entered last, his frame unassuming but his eyes holding the weary sharpness of someone who had witnessed too many betrayals to be surprised by anything anymore. "I am Agent Nolan Price, Federal Counter-Intel Division," he said, taking the center of the room. "We have been tracking the chain of events around the warehouse fire and identified you as the central figure almost 3 weeks ago. We waited for the precise moment to intervene, because appearing earlier would likely have placed you in greater danger from the very organization you were embedded in." Emily only nodded, her mind needing a few additional beats to absorb the idea that someone out there actually understood the scale of what she had been dragged into. Nolan sat down, pulling a file from his briefcase. "We know about the poetry notebook, and we know part of it contains code planted by the FSB to test potential deep-cover assets individuals raised from childhood as ordinary American citizens, but holding roots that can be controlled. You, Emily, are one of them, but it appears their plan shifted off course when you decoded more than they expected, more than they intended anyone to decode." Ryan's hands tightened. He did not look at Nolan. He looked only at Emily, as if the truth he needed did not live in government files but in the clarity of her eyes. Emily met his gaze and shook her head slowly. "I did not know anything. I was only doing my job." Nolan nodded. "That is why we are here. Because you have not chosen a side, you now have the right to choose one." He handed her a packet, dossiers of individuals tied to the warehouse event, with Juno's name slashed-underlined in red ink. But what sent a tremor through Emily was the photograph tucked between the pages. Her father not in a death report, but in a grainy snapshot taken in Belarus 5 years earlier. Nolan's voice softened. "We never confirmed his death, and it is possible he was the one who left the first poems." Emily went still. If that was true, then everything she believed about death, about loss, even about memory itself, might have been rewritten. And now, with the FBI beginning an investigation not only into the FSB but into the network buried inside the United States, she was no longer someone dragged into a war she did not understand. She was standing at its center, and for the first time, Emily felt she was not merely a victim. She was the living witness to a plan built across decades, and possibly the only mind sharp enough to turn the entire board upside down. 3 days after the meeting with Agent Nolan, Emily was transported to a federal security facility on the outskirts of Maryland for temporary protection and information assessment. The place was a secluded compound buried deep within the woods, isolated from the outside world, surrounded by electrified fencing and monitored by an intricate system of sensors. Each morning she was given fresh investigative updates, briefed by linguistics and cryptology experts. Yet the only thing Emily truly wanted was a single answer: who had written the poems, and why she had been chosen. She had begun to accept that she might be a pawn raised in the shadows, but she still did not know whose hand was moving the final pieces. And then, on a rain-soaked afternoon, the answer arrived in the most brutal way. A Russian diplomatic delegation, under the guise of cybersecurity cooperation with the United States, sent a formal communiqué requesting special collaboration with Emily Shaw, a dual-heritage citizen believed to be connected to a series of defense-related data leaks in Eastern Europe. Leaks the FSB suspected might have been passed on by a former traitorous employee. The language of the communiqué was careful, neither accusatory nor permissive, leaving no real room to refuse. They were not asking for Emily to be detained. They were requesting she be returned to assist in tracing the origins of the breach. But everyone in the briefing room understood the truth. If she left American soil with them, she would never return. Emily sat across from a Russian representative named Viktor Malenkov, a man with refined manners and a voice so gentle it bordered on believable. He handed her a copy of an encrypted intelligence report, the handwritten notes on its margins unmistakably resembling her long-dead father's script. Victor did not look at her as he spoke. "You know better than anyone that blood does not disappear. It only sleeps. Your father was part of the program you are now trying to unravel. He did not betray America, but he did not belong to it either. And you, Emily, are the final bridge. Come home." From the corner of the room, Ryan stepped forward, his presence like a slow-burning flame, ready to break its containment. He wore no suit, carried no weapon, yet his stance alone silenced the room. "No," he said, firm and steady, without raising his voice. "She is not going anywhere. If you have evidence, work with the FBI. But if you are trying to frame an American with a past you manufactured, I will be the first to expose it." Victor turned to Ryan without losing composure. "And who do you believe you are in this matter?" Ryan moved closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "I am the man you thought died 10 years ago in an ambush in Moldova. I survived, and I know exactly how your people operate. If you wanted to take someone, you would not ask. You would make them disappear. But with Emily, you have to ask, because she frightens you." A heavy silence settled over the room. Victor slowly closed the file, stood, and inclined his head. "We will not force anything, but she will have to choose sooner or later. When the one who wrote those poems returns, no one will be able to shield her from the truth." He left the room, carrying with him an atmosphere as dense as a storm that had passed through without releasing a single drop. Emily remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the dossier bearing her father's handwriting, while Ryan looked at her as though the entire world were waiting for an answer hidden somewhere in her expression. But she said nothing, because she understood that the only choice ahead was not between leaving or staying. The only choice was to discover precisely who she was up against, and who among them was still writing the unfinished poem she had now become part of. After Victor left the briefing room and Ryan's refusal to let Emily be returned settled like a blade between them, the atmosphere inside the security center thickened into a silent strain, as though everyone sensed something deeper, darker, was shifting beneath the surface. Emily went back to her isolation room with the poetry notebook and the dossier the FSB had left behind, including the handwritten notes believed to be her father's, along with several encrypted fragments still unsolved. She did not sleep for 18 hours. She sat among the pages, the poems, the maps, and the annotations, her eyes red with fatigue, yet her mind disturbingly lucid. And then, from a small irregularity in a seemingly meaningless poem, Emily uncovered a truth neither side had ever considered. The FSB was being betrayed as well. She began with a short free verse poem whose opening line read, "No one sees blood beneath the last snow of the season." The poem repeated 3 times the image of the blue cap without a symbol, which at first seemed merely a metaphor for fracture within an institution. But when she cross-referenced it with satellite maps the FBI provided of locations tied to FSB-related incidents over the past 8 years, Emily found a pattern. Every data leak or disappearance had occurred near specialized communication relays, places no one expected any foreign presence. One of those coordinates matched the site where her father had last been photographed in Belarus. She wrote each line of the poem across a whiteboard, emphasizing the words that involved direction, objects, and time. By interlacing segments from 12 different poems, she created an entirely new sequence of messages, The content centered around an unnamed figure known only as the Sixth Gatekeeper, someone who served no faction and had deliberately inserted false information into the FSB's encrypted network to fracture its internal trust, which meant the FSB had unknowingly used these poems as tools for surveillance and agent control while being manipulated by an unseen hand. Emily presented her findings to Nolan, Ryan, and a team of FBI analysts. At first, they doubted her, assuming she was emotionally entangled and trying to strike back at the FSB with conjecture. But when she showed them how recurring terms like gatekeeper, empty garden, and the reverse path all pointed toward corrupted communication charts, the mood in the room shifted. Nolan sat in silence for a long moment before finally admitting, almost reluctantly, that if the FSB could not control its own encrypted channels, then the entire intelligence world was operating on a vessel already taking on water. Ryan, however, was not surprised. He simply looked at Emily with unmasked admiration. But Emily felt no victory. She felt hollow, because this meant her father, if he was still alive, might also be hunted, not by a single enemy but by multiple fractured networks devouring themselves. She told Nolan plainly, "The poems are not calls to action. They are distress signals. They were written not only to hide data but to warn that even the FSB has been breached from within. And if that is true, then any one of us, including all of you, may already be watched through a system we believe we control." Nolan leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. He understood now this was no longer just about Emily or Ryan. This was a silent war where truth warped through poetry, encryption, and memory. And in that war, Emily was no longer the prey. She was the first one to read the message hidden between the blank spaces. News of Emily's discovery that the FSB was being manipulated spread like fire racing through a gas-lined basement, not through the press or any public outlet, but through covert government channels where every sentence was encrypted under 3 layers of security. And everyone who heard it understood that this revelation could tilt the global balance. The FBI released nothing externally, but inside the system, Emily had become someone they could no longer overlook. She was no longer merely a decoder. She had become a living information entity, a singular reservoir of insight suspended between languages, symbols, and secret histories that no intelligence apparatus fully possessed. Agent Nolan met her personally on a rainy evening in the high-security witness sector. He wore no suit, only a dark canvas jacket, his eyes tired yet unwavering. He handed her a folder stamped in pale green, the words, "Top Secret Special Recruitment," italicized across the cover. "We want you to work with us," he said, "not as an operative, but as a senior strategic analyst. You see the system in a way none of us can. You don't look at it like a machine. You look at it the way you look at a poem that breathes." Emily held the file but did not open it. She gazed out through the glass where rain fell in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat waiting for an answer. "What about Ryan?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the response. Nolan exhaled. "He was taken into custody this morning. We had no choice. His record is filled with gray zones, and with Valenti's burned down, the unaccounted underground transactions, he is facing at least 5 federal charges." Emily bit her lip, her heart sinking. "He saved my life." Nolan nodded. "I know. And I believe he is not someone we need to eliminate. But procedure is procedure. Still, if you agree to work with us, you will have a voice, and you can use it to shape his outcome." Emily said nothing. Inside her, logic and emotion tore at each other, fear of being drawn into yet another system of control, battling against the fierce desire to use her abilities to mean something. She thought of Ryan, imperfect, forged in darkness, a man who once commanded like a kingpin, but who had never once forced her to do anything. He had given her the right to choose, even when it meant he might lose everything. She opened the folder. Inside were the recruitment terms, confidentiality clauses, and access privileges to Tier 3, encrypted networks. She scanned each page, pausing at the section labeled Specialized Role, where it read, Strategic Consultant for Linguistic and Symbolic Counterintelligence. She let out a small, incredulous laugh. It sounded like a title written by the same hand that had crafted the coded poems. She closed the file and looked up at Nolan. "I will work with you," she said, "but I have one condition. I want access to Ryan. Not as a witness, as an ally." Nolan held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But remember this, Emily. Once you step in, there is no way back. None of us are the same after reading those poems. Emily smiled, a thin smile like the edge of a hidden blade folded inside a book. "I have never been the same," she murmured. "I am only just beginning to understand who I am." Asquith. Emily was transferred to a special cryptanalysis center buried beneath the basement of a federal defense research facility in Langley, a place without windows, without cell signals, where every door opened only through a fingerprint scan paired with biometric authentication. She worked in a small room whose walls were fully soundproofed, lit by a warm amber glow that never strained the eyes, with every piece of equipment controlled by government-level security oversight. On the desk lay a reconstructed copy of the original poetry notebook, this time reordered not by page number but by the logical pattern of hidden symbols embedded within each stanza. Emily did not work alone. She was accompanied by 2 experts in ancient languages and a data analyst, though most of the time they hovered at the margins, watching the way she parsed each line as if she were peeling away the hardened skin of a serpent that had matured through the long, cold decades of the Cold War. A poem that at first seemed nothing more than a blurred image of a ship leaving harbor in early autumn carried within it financial routing codes, sequences of numbers embedded inside the syllabic structure, hiding behind the rhythmic repetition of initial vowels and consonants. After 5 consecutive days without stepping away from her desk for more than an hour at a time, Emily uncovered a match between a series of unusual character strings and the formatting of cryptocurrency wallets. When she compared them against international payment ledgers, she confirmed the existence of 13 electronic wallets scattered across nations with no extradition agreements, their combined financial activity over the past 2 years exceeding more than 47 million United States dollars. The transactions were recorded under shell corporations, but what made Emily's skin prickle was not the sum itself but the destination of the money. Most of it circled back to accounts tied to 3 former FSB officers who had died in accidents with no known cause. She expanded her analysis, cross-referencing the poems that mentioned the courier who never returned, the shadow beneath the archive basement, and the last breath lingering inside the 9th mailbox. Each image, once placed correctly, was not merely verse but coordinates, directions, a hidden cartography disguised as art. Emily constructed an underground network map, revealing that within the FSB itself existed a faction of internal operatives who served neither Moscow nor the West, acting independently for financial gain and the dominion of information. In other words, no one controlled them. They controlled everything. She delivered her findings to Nolan and the FBI's special team, along with the wallet keys and traceable coordinates. When the report reached senior officials, the atmosphere shifted from astonishment to a sharpened wariness. She had not only traced a vast money-laundering network, but had also exposed a portion of an intelligence war never publicly acknowledged, a war in which information was manipulated not to safeguard a nation but to manipulate the very institutions built to defend it. Nolan approached her after the briefing, and for the first time his gaze held not caution but a rare form of respect. He rested a hand on the red-stamped dossier and said quietly, "You just accomplished something no one has managed in 2 decades of intelligence work, and you stepped across a threshold no one else dared to cross." Emily merely nodded, her eyes fixed on the final poem still not fully deciphered. It began with a whisper, "Look behind the current," and she knew that somewhere in the depths of a past she had never dared excavate lay yet another layer of code waiting to be read. But with more than $47 million traced, an internal spy network exposed, and half the intelligence world quietly unraveling beneath the surface, Emily understood that she was no longer the anonymous waitress at Valenti's. She had become the interpreter of secrets written in blood and darkness. The interrogation room lay far beneath the earth, its thick concrete walls without windows, its single fluorescent light suspended overhead casting a cold halo across the metal table and the 2 chairs facing one another. Emily stepped inside with her hair tied neatly back, a folder held in her hand, and found Ryan already seated, his wrists cuffed to the steel loop fixed to the tabletop, yet not a trace of his familiar presence had dimmed. His eyes were still as sharp as the first time she had seen him at Valenti's, though now there was a depth behind them, a quiet abyss that only someone who had survived the underworld could recognize. She sat down, set the folder on the table but did not open it, simply looked at him for a moment before speaking softly, without pity but with truth. "You've lost weight." Ryan let out a faint, hoarse laugh. "They don't give me midnight pizza like Valenti's." Emily didn't smile, but something in her gaze softened. "I didn't come to talk about food. I have a proposal." Ryan tilted his head slightly, waiting without reacting. She opened the folder and pulled out a plan printed in pale blue ink, divided into 3 sections: financial analysis, organizational structure, and a proposed legal framework. I traced the money the coded poetry led to, more than $47 million across 13 encrypted wallets. The FBI is trying to freeze everything, but they will only capture the surface. I know how to control the entire system and turn it into a reconstruction fund. Ryan raised an eyebrow, his mouth tightening. You're talking about laundering dirty money? No, she answered firmly. I'm talking about turning it into a weapon against the people who manipulated the system, both the FSB and the other shadows behind all of this. I want to create an independent analysis firm, a legitimate one, specializing in decoding non-traditional data, not tied to any government, not serving war, but strong enough to keep the balance of information out of the hands of anyone who would twist it. Ryan sat still, and his expression slowly shifted from doubt to concentration. And what do you want from me? A co-founder. I can't build this alone. I need someone who understands how the underworld operates, but who has already chosen to step out of it. Ryan let out a low, humorless breath. I'm cuffed to a table, accused of 5 federal offenses, and you're asking me to start a company? I'm not asking, Emily replied quietly. I'm giving you the chance to change how your name is written in the world. Ryan looked down at the table, silent for a long while, remembering the times he had stood at the edge between life and death, the choices that had led him here. If it all ended with a sentence, then everything he had ever done would fade without meaning. But if there was still a chance, however fragile, to rebuild something this time with transparency and his own hands, then perhaps this was why Emily had come into his life at all. He lifted his eyes to hers. One condition. Tell me, she said. I don't want to return to the old world, but I also don't want to be chained to a new one without the right to choose. Every decision must be transparent. And if there comes a day I need to walk away, you have to let me go. Emily nodded without hesitation. I don't keep anyone beside me by force. I only need people who know why they choose to stay. Ryan smiled, and for the first time the smile held a glimmer of real light. Then you have me. They sat there for several more minutes without speaking. Outside, the echo of agents' footsteps traveled down the long corridor. But inside the room a pact had been sealed, not on paper, not with signatures, but with the quiet resolve of 2 people who had once lived in darkness, and now chose to step into a light that still had no ending written for it. 3 months after the final meeting between Emily and Ryan in the interrogation room, a modest 3-story glass building on the outskirts of Arlington quietly opened its doors under the name Novalink Strategies. There were no flashy signs, no media coverage, no press conferences. From the outside, it looked like a small tech consultancy specializing in data, yet inside it held a world of language, algorithms, and coded verses that no one but Emily truly understood how to read. The main office occupied the 2nd floor, where natural light streamed through radiation-shielded double glass. The desks were orderly, and the walls were pinned with maps connected by delicate strands of red, blue, and gold thread. In that room, Emily sat before a screen, her eyes no longer carrying the guarded look of the waitress she once was, but the sharp gaze of someone who had walked through many layers of reality, peeling back truth with both instinct and cold analysis. She no longer hid her real name, nor concealed the faint Russian cadence woven into her American speech. Emily Shaw had become a name spoken in closed-door meetings across multiple intelligence agencies, not as a suspect, but as a phenomenon. Around her, the initial team consisted of only 8 people: 2 linguists, a blockchain specialist, a retired counterintelligence operative, 3 data engineers, and Ryan himself, who served as strategic overseer. Though still entangled in legal negotiations for full exoneration, Ryan was allowed to participate as an advisor. No equity, no financial signature yet. The look in his eyes whenever he spoke with Emily made it clear to everyone that Novalink would not exist without both of them. They operated on a 3-layer model: decoding nonlinear data, extracting behavioral patterns from non-traditional symbols, and advising on information crisis mitigation. No agency hired them publicly, yet reports bearing the Novalink logo began appearing in emergency briefings at the State Department, in the folders carried by ambassadors heading to Geneva, and occasionally passed quietly down the silent hallways of the United Nations. Emily granted no interviews and appeared in no publications. She sought no spotlight, but to her team, she was the heartbeat of the entire system, a woman who once lived like a shadow and now stood at the center of a knowledge network no one could counterfeit. On an early autumn morning, as the leaves turned gold along the road leading to the headquarters, Emily stood before a new analytic board where a fresh sequence of poetry had arrived from an anonymous source. Each line carried the strange, familiar rhythm she knew so well, but this time there was no fear. She smiled not out of ease, but because she had learned to converse with the shadows instead of fleeing from them. Behind the glass door, her team was already discussing a coded case in Istanbul, a strange data leak from Central Asia, and a poem signed by the sixth gatekeeper. Emily picked up her cup of coffee and walked into the conference room, her voice steady, her eyes resolute. Start from the first line. Every verse has a reason for being. The room fell silent as the team leaned in, each person focused, none questioning her leadership. In 3 months, she had never needed to assert authority through a title. She proved it by seeing what others could only sense, and in that moment, Emily knew she was no longer the invisible girl in the dim corner of Valenti's. She was the one who could read the world's poem, and more than that, the one who could write its final lines through her own choosing. One quiet weekend morning, just as the sun touched the wide third-floor windows of Novalink, Emily received an encrypted message, sent from a device no longer registered in the FBI's tracking system. The first sequence of characters made her stop in the middle of the hallway, her breath caught somewhere in her throat. It was a format only Ryan had ever used, followed by a single instruction: open only when alone. She stepped back into her office, closed the door, lowered the blinds, and entered the code. The message appeared slowly, each line unfolding as if written in his voice, not from the lips she remembered, but from the deepest, most private stratum of consciousness. If you are reading this, I have probably gone. Not left, but vanished from the line of sight neither of us could hold forever. Do not look for me, because this time, you no longer need to depend on anyone. You are strong enough to write the rest of this yourself. Beneath the message was a key code, not for unlocking a stash of money, but for opening a data library where Ryan had stored his notes, his old networks, and the names that once lived submerged beneath the surface. He believed a day would come when she might need it, not to destroy anything, but to protect what she was building. At the end of the message was a short, unsigned poem, yet Emily knew exactly who had written it. Those who once lived by darkness, if they choose the light, will burn before they are ever seen. But if anyone can rewrite the night with intellect, perhaps that person is you. She sat still for a long moment, her hand resting on the keyboard. Outside the room, her team continued working. Life drifted on, and the world moved under new layers of masks as it always did. But in that single moment, Emily understood that Ryan had not disappeared. He had simply stepped into the background, becoming the foundation that had already served its purpose, leaving the canvas to her. This story was never truly about espionage, nor money, nor betrayal, nor loyalty. It was the journey of a human being who went from living unseen to becoming the one who could perceive the truths the world had chosen to ignore. And perhaps the greatest lesson did not lie in the codes or in the poems encrypted with shadows, but in Emily's refusal to give up. She faced the darkness not to shatter it, but to understand its existence, and from that understanding carve out a path no one had imagined. And what about you? What do you think of Emily's journey? Have you ever felt invisible in a world crowded with noise and layered with masks? If you have, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear from you, to listen to the truths that live deep in your heart, because that emotional connection is what draws us closer to one another each day. If this story has moved you, please remember to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it with someone who might also need a small light to keep walking forward in their own life. Every day, we will bring you new stories, touching, reflective, and full of depth, where you may just find a piece of yourself. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. May you be healthy, joyful, and at peace each day. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.